Let's talk about death, and not like in a video game context, at least not yet. Let's talk about the existential unknown, the one true inevitability, the unfathomable, misunderstood, incomprehensible biological necessity we call dying. We all know it's happening, and although we all interpret it differently, none of us really know the scope of what it means for us, right? Some find comfort in its inevitability, some find panic in its finality. Yet most of us, all of us if you're watching hours of video game analysis YouTube videos, find death non-threatening enough to live our lives the way we want to live them. Watching long videos, sleeping in, playing overly long video games about cowboys. Why? How? How has the human condition allowed for this? How do I have both the knowledge of my impending removal from this world and still commit myself to making seemingly inconsequential, unnecessarily long YouTube videos? How do I live, at most times, comfortably with this knowledge? My point here is that, isn't it interesting how our minds and bodies can be complicit in living our lives the way we do, while simultaneously knowing that we are not, in the grand scheme of things, long for this world? And trust me, this is not some moralistic sermon I'm giving you about making the most of your time on this pale blue dot. It's not. I would be the biggest hypocrite in the world if I were making that argument. I just frame my video this way because I am unsure if I've ever played a game that has given me more existential questions, more confusion, than both of the gosh darn dagnabbit Red Dead Redemption games. Let me expand. This is the case in two major ways. Red Dead Redemption emphasizes existential dread in two major ways. Diegetically in its story, in its themes, and its morals, but it also emphasizes it in a completely separate way. Red Dead Redemption 2 specifically is, in a world where I'm given maybe 2 to 3 hours max to play a game a day, hardly much of a video game. It is crafted with the intention of simulation, designed with the expressed purpose of recreating the rhythms and lifestyles of turn-of-the-century nomadism. If you've played the game before, you know this to be the case. This isn't actually an indictment of the game. Video games should be whatever they want to be. What it is, however, is a hard sell for those that wake up in the morning, go to work, get home, and sit down to ostensibly do more work in a video game. At times, both of these games ended up being the crab legs of video games. It's a heck of a lot of work to get to the good part. It's messy, time-intensive, and the result at the end, if it's not all that great, might have you asking, was this even worth it? Now, this is a reduction of an argument I will obviously flesh out. Still, the point remains. Red Dead Redemption 2, and to an extent Red Dead Redemption, are video games that frequently had me asking, why? What is the point here? The game itself had me questioning how I spend my time on this planet. More importantly, it had me questioning what a video game should strive to be. Are video games meant to be strictly exercises in fun, or artistic expression, even at a sacrifice of fun? Of course, this is partly hyperbole, but the fact remains. Red Dead Redemption often demands more from you than it gives. In the past couple of months, I've spent a good deal of time thinking about Red Dead Redemption, thinking about how it makes me feel, how it plays, how it compares to its genre counterparts. I've thought about it a lot, and I realize the more I think about it, the less it all makes sense to me. The review scores specifically. Let's just say I have a great deal of conflicting and awkward thoughts about this dastardly couple of video games. Real quick, in the event that I haven't spoiled anything yet, and somehow you haven't been spoiled to this point, this is a spoiler warning. This video will cover the front to back of both Red Dead Redemption games. I won't cover every story beat, but every story beat certainly runs the risk of being covered. You have been warned. In Red Dead Redemption, John Marston dies. In Red Dead Redemption 2, Arthur dies. The first Red Dead Redemption games get a little bit of a pass in this department because it was, at the time, a pretty interesting and surprising twist to many that your main playable character dies at the end, if not heavily foreshadowed through themes of redemption being a death errand. Red Dead Redemption 2, however, does not have the same element of surprise on its hands. It is instead forced to reconcile and navigate through the problem of a very specific type of dramatic irony. The player knows that Arthur is going to die. The player knows that most everyone in the story is going to die. And in a game so dependent upon a great deal of emotional and mental participation from the player, the cognitive dissonance of your impending doom and your required input becomes one of the main ludonarrative conflicts of the entire experience. This happens like we've mentioned, in two separate ways. It happens from a narrative perspective, insofar that we have played the first game and we never saw one Arthur Morgan. And it happens from a gameplay perspective, insofar that a lot of the systems and required inputs from your end are based in a sort of diegetic narrative context that implies a sort of lived life inside of the game. Okay, I'm going to expand on this because it definitely gets a little dense. Certain video games require you to buy in a little more than other video games. Buy in the sense that you have to acknowledge, at least to some degree, that the characters, worlds, or communities in the game are more than just ones and zeros rendered onto a screen. Of course, they aren't real people, and they are just renderings, but there are certain games that ask things of you with little to no actual gameplay results, but instead expect you to do them on the basis that you are so invested in the story being told that you are willing. It's the difference between the city building element of Assassin's Creed 2, which is almost entirely gameplay and currency driven, and something like Pelican Town in Stardew Valley. If you were not so heavily rewarded for your investments in the city of Monteregione in AC2, there would be absolutely no reason to invest into the player-built city. Conversely, there are countless elements in Farming Simulator Stardew Valley that are almost entirely driven by this idea of being bought into the story and the culture of the game. Your cat or dog will survive regardless of your input. However, you better believe players will put food in their bowl every morning, using valuable time of their normally heavily scheduled days. Many players will light a fire for the homeless man hanging around town in the winter. Many town events and conversations exist regardless of you. Wait, but they don't, do they? They aren't even rendered. If you choose to stay home on your farm the day of the Easter festival, you missed the Easter festival. But the festival never existed unless you go and render it. My point here is that Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2 expect this sort of participation from you. However, it fights against that expectation with a horribly conflictive game design philosophy. Oftentimes, it is easy to immerse yourself in the world in these games. Other times, it's tragically difficult. Essentially, this is a breakdown of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations. Some games require more intrinsic motivation from the players, while others will motivate the player with entirely gameplay-related rewards, such as currency. Red Dead Redemption wants a bit of both, but doesn't pull its weight enough to justify either. Look, the idea that Red Dead Redemption 2 is wanting its cake and eating it too has certainly been spoken about before. However, I don't think it has been explained just how baked into the design of the game this thought actually is. It comes down to this. The settlement design, the health and weight mechanics, the relationships, the honor systems, the hair growth, it's all made so inconsequential by both the gameplay and narrative choices. Not only do these mechanics hardly work or matter in terms of your participation, but you, the player, know that the camp is going to move again. You know that most of your gang are not long for this world, yet the game asks for your participation nonetheless. It is one of the most mind-boggling, interesting, thought-provoking, and frustrating instances of this tenuous relationship between the player and the game. For some reason, it affected me profoundly. It made me question whether or not it was a good thing. It made me take a break from the second game for weeks because my motivation to continue a story I knew was careening toward death and disaster was at an all-time low. It made me appreciate the games from a whole new perspective when I realized just how unique and interesting that feeling was. It made me hate it again when I realized how poorly the gameplay reflected these unique feelings. It made me write 20,000 words on a godforsaken Western. Enjoy. Red Dead Redemption is a series about contrast. It's a game overwhelmingly concerned with the ways in which people, cultures, or ideas clash. And under that umbrella of contrast, Red Dead Redemption is a game about conflict. In a way, viewing the game through these two lenses opens up an entire understanding of the ethos of Rockstar's approach to not only the Wild West, but their game design philosophy. In the Wild West, man, it's a tough goal for video games. Rockstar games should, at the very least, be commended for treading upon somewhat untouched ground in terms of video games. The Wild West isn't difficult in terms of art design. The Wild West is difficult because it's a video game. So much of the Wild West is characterized through space. Games are consistently lambasted for their open worlds being too empty. How does a video game developer navigate the artistic obligation of an accurate recreation of the Western frontier versus the consumer obligation of creating a compelling and interesting video game experience? At what point do we begin to have a problem with an open world sandbox that has, well, too much sand in its box? So much of Red Dead Redemption is reliant on exposing the contradictions and conflict embedded into the advancement of modernity. As industry spreads westward across the Great Plains of the United States, so too does a number of other implications. Alongside industry is law, alongside cities comes government, and alongside the tides of government comes a new radical Yankee morality. Above all, alongside modernity comes the end of the West as its inhabitants know it. And this is, in a way, what makes Red Dead Redemption such a powerful rhetorical device. The game takes place within the twilight of the American West, a wilting body losing the battle of attrition against the cancer of modernity. It is a profoundly risky premise to make a game around, not necessarily accompanied by risky game design, but absolutely a choice deserving of recognition. The Wild West is an icon, it's a cultural monolith. It requires no introduction. The mythos of the American West has permeated across media in so many different ways, from John Wayne to There Will Be Blood. There's an unbelievable amount of life breathed into the American Wild West. To delve into the cultural and philosophical implications of the death of that Wild West, rather than just placing you in a sandbox of the Wild West in its prime, is a frankly terrifying thing to do from a video game development standpoint. And yet, I think they are able to accomplish it. I think that Red Dead Redemption is a stellar piece of rhetoric, a stunning recreation of the West, and contains a startling amount of philosophy for silly video game analysis channels like me to chew on. I believe Red Dead Redemption, as a series especially, to be an incredible concept. I don't, however, believe Red Dead Redemption, or its prequel, to be anything other than a pretty, okay video game. And I understand this opinion comes packaged out with some degree of internet hate. I understand the significance of Red Dead Redemption in terms of video games. However, I must insist that you understand that this video is not so long for no reason in particular. I will obviously qualify this heinous statement over the course of this video. This video is first and foremost an analysis of Rockstar's world that they have created both in the May 2010 Red Dead Redemption, but also 2018's Red Dead Redemption 2. It will be a look into the cultural, rhetorical, philosophical, and literary significance of a game that has a lot more cultural, rhetorical, philosophical, and literary significance than you might think. This video is a celebration of what I think is one of the more thematically profound games to come out of the Xbox 360 era of games. However, this video also comes with a critique of a game so bogged down by rose-colored glasses and developer praise that to look objectively at RDR is to accomplish an extremely difficult task. Rockstar Games makes good games. More importantly, maybe they make consistently good games. Between Bully, Grand Theft Auto 4, debatably LA Noire, Red Dead, and GTA 5, there's hardly any doubt that Rockstar is within, depending on your metrics, the top tier of video game developers, alongside Naughty Dog and Nintendo. This does not, however, excuse their game design from criticism of an overwhelming ubiquity, an antithetical ludonarrative philosophy, and an anachronistic approach to open world design. And this is sort of exactly why I'm investigating these games with such a close lens. If you are unaware, one of my previous videos is over Grand Theft Auto 4. In that video, I mentioned that it is the first chapter in the book of contemporary Rockstar games. And while I guess I would encourage you to have watched that video first, I understand that that is pretty unrealistic to expect. However, it must be understood that there is a tremendous amount of design decisions and cultural significance wrapped in these two games holistically that you just won't get if you analyze them both in isolation. And it goes past the obvious game design-y elements that draw the two games together. Clearly, they're using the same engine. Clearly, RDR is derivative of a lot of the things you can find in GTA 4. Even John Marston controls freakishly similar to Nico. Instead, there are threads to be connected between the two games in the way that they irreverently approach American culture and the American dream and its ambitions. Understanding that these games are all cut from the same cloth completely colors our reading of Red Dead Redemption as a series. It contextualizes it insofar that in terms of video game design, it represents such a notable time in Generation 7 where open world linearity and meaningless side quests and collectibles were ubiquitous. It contextualizes it in the sense that Red Dead Redemption really is a product of its time, a game so dated. And please understand I'm not using that term in the negative way that people tend to use that word, but dated in the sense that its design decisions genuinely place the game within a discernible time in video game design trends. Its open world icons and story design are the fossilized rings in the metaphorical tree that places itself in an era of games designed around those decisions. At this point, my GTA video is getting pretty old now and might warrant a rewatch if you're a big fan of the channel looking to really sink your teeth fully into this video. In reality, however, I don't expect that. If you are new, my name is David OZ, and I write about video games and their philosophical, thematic, and literary merits. This is actually Chapter 2 in the Book of Contemporary Rockstar Video Games. And quick housekeeping for friends and fans of the channel before we take off. My streaming life has been pretty inconsistent, but I want to say in this video specifically and quickly where you can find me live. The link to my Twitch account is below. It is different than the one I have mentioned in previous videos. I work on videos and play games I'm covering on there and love talking with people that have come from this channel. I'll talk a lot more about what I'm doing in the future with the channel at the end of this video if you're interested. If you've never played either of these titles, I would sympathize with you not wanting to grind through its lengthy gameplay pacing. I would encourage you, or I guess I should say implore you, to watch the game. Research the game. Find a Let's Play. Red Dead Redemption is an incredibly well thought out series from a world building and creative mindset.
You implore me? You implore me!
I genuinely, wholeheartedly believe the Red Dead Redemption games to be somewhat of an artistic achievement, a true triumph of digital software, just not much of an extraordinary interactive one. One of the defining features of Westerns were that they were morality tales, a simple good versus a simple evil pit against each other with clear ethical boundaries. To have grown up in the United States is to have been held witness to an unbelievable amount of recycling of this concept. The culture of the US West has become a genre in of itself. Isn't that insane? There's so much mythos packed into this simple genre of media, yet has become instantly recognizable to anyone who is familiar with the concept of a Western. These tales almost always star some sort of nomadic man whose mystery shrouds him the same way his beard does. And in true Rockstar fashion, the developers of Red Dead Redemption are fully aware of these genre tropes in the same way that they were fully aware of the cultural stereotypes of America in Grand Theft Auto. I think this might be Rockstar's sort of claim to fame, if anything, about their thematic world design. Their ability to take on established ideas and cultural monoliths and expose them for some of their hypocrisies or exaggerations is pretty much unmatched by anyone else in the video game industry right now. They are the kings of caricature, the sultans of satire. The writers at Rockstar fully understood these genre conventions, and instead of saying, hey, let's subvert these expectations and be totally different, Rockstar says, let's take these expectations and keep them, but manipulate and distort them into what is a farce of the genre. However, as we will learn, where GTA distorted cultural standards with humor and exaggeration, in a lot of ways Red Dead Redemption kind of does the opposite, by distorting the standards of the Western through the reliance Marston has on the help of others. And where Rockstar could have made a game in the heyday of the Wild West, they instead make one in its demise. Now this is an important enough distinction to make in my book. Red Dead Redemption isn't a satire of the Wild West, like GTA was a satire of the United States. Red Dead Redemption is a swan song of the Wild West, a death rattle of what was once and what will never be again. And I like to use the comparison of John Marston and Nico Bellic as an easy way to explain Marston's significance in Red Dead's subtext. Where Nico, as we talked about in depth in the GTA video, was representative of a person on the outside looking in toward the United States, I think that John Marston is indicative of a person on the inside looking out of the Wild West. It all comes back to our reading of Red Dead being in a lot of ways thematically opposite of GTA 4. John Marston represents one of the last dying gasps of air of the Wild West, and he clearly wants desperately out. He is on the inside of the dying breed of the Wild West, and he is longingly desiring the catharsis of normalcy, of family, of relying on others. John Marston lived the West, and now he wants out. Nico Bellic lived the totalitarian regimes of authoritarianism. He lived the lack of freedom, and he wanted into America, a place where he finds out is just as full of violence and control. It is no accident that John Marston's criminal career is in its twilight alongside the twilight of the Wild West, and it is no accident that both meet their end at the end of the game. The start of RDR is an interesting one that really gets my pretentious video game writing motor running, if you know what I mean. It's a framing device for the rest of the game, a literary tool underused in video games, but essentially at the core of a lot of the greatest works of literature over the years. I mean, the granddaddy, the man himself, William Shakespeare, used framing devices to historically influential extents. The whole scene is unquestionably heavy-handed, but I don't know, heavy-handed is better than nothing in the proverbial hand at all. This heavy-handedness, to me, is Rockstar actively making an attempt at artistic focus. And that's kind of enough for me right now. I think a lot of people will tend to disregard this part of the game as bad writing, and it's kind of hard to disagree. It is forced and anything but discreet. However, it is important to understand some context here, given that at the time, this was a marked improvement over the then state of video game storytelling, especially for AAA console gaming, open world games in particular. Since 2010, we have seen an incredible amount of progress made in this department. And while it is rudimentary and campy, this scene should be commended for a step in the right direction toward making video game stories cohesive, focused narratives. There's honestly a lot to unpack here. First with the fact that it takes place on, by no accident, a train. And I won't expound upon the cultural and technological significance of the train, but it's absolutely important to understand that they are in a lot of ways representative of that which the outlaw hates. That is, of course, in the fact that the outlaw robs and pillages trains, but also in the sense that they act as industrial arteries, connecting the United States via industry and population. These arteries eat away at the analog nature of the West. They move products and people en masse, allowing for a rapid industrialization of the West. The trains themselves are literally the vehicles in which the West dissipates. Starting John Marston on a train like this is no accident. And then, of course, you have the young girl speaking about the fact that humans are learning ways to allow themselves to fly. The old women speaking about the savagery of the West. The game is forcing the player to understand that there are two separate worlds colliding here.
But Father, do you mean unless an innocent receives communion, they're destined to go to hell? It hardly seems fair.
What I mean to say, Jenny, is that there is a great deal of difference between an innocent and a savage.
I never thought of it that way.
Yes, they lived like animals, but they're happier now.
And listen to this young woman opening up the conversation about morality. It is a direct, undeniable signposting to the player that says, this game will be about moral ambiguity, about conflicts of ideology, and about the contrasting philosophies of the American East and West. You can see then why this scene is sort of heavy-handed. You can also see, hopefully, with a degree of optimism, why I love it so much. It is a clear and direct attempt at artistic focus and moral philosophy. Most games don't even make it this far.
Father. Sometimes I find it impossible to make the distinction between a loving act and a hateful one. I mean, they often seem to be the same thing.
Yes, Jenny, it is confusing. But you only have to ask me if you need help.
Indeed.
Well, here we are, Mrs. Bush. Armadillo.
After getting off this vehicle of modernity, we are met with Armadillo, the quintessential stereotype of Western cities, tumbleweed and all. You have your saloon, your main street, your doctor's office, your stable. Whatever image you have of the Wild West settlement, town, it's probably some version of this. After seeing this opening, it should be abundantly clear that Red Dead is dealing with heavy-handed contrasting images. You are taught very simple things about John. He did bad things, and the government is making him hunt down the men he did those things with, if he ever hopes to see his family again. Already, John is being torn between two worlds. John Marston is a living, breathing stereotype, an anachronistic video game character frozen in the amber of the Xbox 360. And even after shamelessly calling him a living, breathing stereotype, in a lot of ways, I love John Marston. One of those ways is the way in which he actually reflects the theme of contrast by simultaneously being that living, breathing stereotype, all the while being a complete subversion of those stereotypes in video games. John Marston has some sort of checkered past, a past he isn't keen on sharing with either the audience or the characters on screen. And while we have a bunch more of a window into what his past was like having played RDR2, it is intended as the first game one should play in the series, and so I will analyze it as such. I generally like this part of his character, and I think it is doubly good in the ways in which it encourages that sort of eye-rolly cliche of the grisly veteran whose past is just too scary to share. This is such a tired trope of the Western, and really of male-oriented fiction to begin with. Where it was originally implemented to manufacture mystery, at this point an ambiguous past marks a more frustrating self-importance rather than a compelling character. I think Rockstar does a really excellent and frankly kind of cool job with this knowledge in the first act of the game, most notably with the relationship between Marston and Marston's lifesaver, Bonnie McFarlane. In a lot of ways, Bonnie at first represents the player, curious and sympathetic toward the main character. She obviously sees something interesting in Marston, and he continues to refrain from sharing anything meaningful about himself, despite Bonnie asking. She becomes frustrated with this after a while, just like the player. She calls him out on his wishy-washiness. She isn't completely turned on by his emotional invulnerability.
You do so love to talk in riddles, Mr. Marston. Do you do that, I wonder, as a substitute for having anything interesting to say?
You see, John Marston has a less than tenuous grasp on his morality. He certainly wishes to be a moral actor in the Wild West. I mean, the game is called Red Dead Redemption. John feels as if he can, or at the very least should, redeem himself for his previous transgressions upon the world. However, it is no surprise to anyone who has played the game that this does not always come easy to old Mr. Marston. Oftentimes he finds himself caught into firefights whose causes could easily be traced back to John. His whole mission, his repentance of his sins, is marred by more sins, by more death, by more harm. The game is essentially asking if there is a redemption arc possible for someone like Marston. There is this idea that John Marston believes that he is something holier than those he used to banditize with. This is, again, heavy-handed, yet a valuable and valid attempt at an interesting character wrinkle. Just look at the way he talks to Bill Williamson in the beginning of the game. I implore you. This is turn of the 20th century. To talk like this is to essentially be flexing your intelligence, or at the very least your literacy. John Marston believes that he is ideologically, morally, philosophically, even educationally more sophisticated and above Dutch's old gang. He believes, at least, that he can redeem himself by turning these men in and getting back to his family. In the ways in which John wishes to be redeemed morally, however, there doesn't seem to be a path for him. John asks a man sexually abusing a woman later in the game, "Are you going to marry that girl?" He often turns down women to say that he is married. John Marston has, to us at least, the most asinine backwards thoughts about morality. He is a walking contradiction, a man as concerned about his faithfulness to his wife as he is unconcerned about the ammunition he spends on human beings. And look, John Marston, much like Nico, is a product of a cruel, violent, and dangerous world. Their response to stimuli is much more a reaction of self-preservation and defense than it is true nefarious evil. Both of these characters fight fire with fire, and when fire is threatening their family, you better believe they're going to fight back. To these two, violence is a necessary mechanism of the cruel world they live in. It's not necessarily a joyful expression of their self. Both want normalcy, both want calm. John desperately wants his family back. He is not against gunning down many a people in order to achieve that goal. He is not a good person, at least not in the traditional utilitarian sense. Of course, this is the issue with the open world sandbox elements of the game and the fact that John Marston can kill indiscriminately for the sake of killing. We spoke a bit about how to justify that with Nico, and I think a lot of that applies happily to John Marston. I don't want to talk about this a whole lot more, I'm afraid. For my style of video, I think that the story missions will be considered canon, and the sandbox elements will have to be considered necessary video gamey elements of the experience. What matters is that Red Dead Redemption, much like Grand Theft Auto, is a story of a character whose response to violence is violence, which of course creates a larger cycle of violence. And let me be clear here, John Marston does not believe himself to be a moral person. In fact, he is constantly talking about how much of a saint he just isn't. John Marston does believe, however, that he knows what is right for himself and his family. He believes himself one step removed from that of Dutch's gang. By the time the credits roll, Rockstar intends for the player to decide if Mr. Marston had accomplished any sort of redemption. Unfortunately, however, Rockstar did the same thing here that so many game developers chose to do during this stretch of games in the turn of the decade. They added in a faux morality system in to determine just how bad or good of a dude old Mr. Marston is. It is unfortunate, of course, because it undermines the story in which the game is trying to tell. That morality is often a matter of perspective, and that John Marston believes that he is, at least in some ways, a moral actor in the universe. These gamified moral systems tear away at any semblance of moral ambiguity, something that Rockstar is clearly interested in, and again, conflicts with the rest of the game by saying that there is some sort of objective moral truth out there. Oftentimes it results in either you killed the bad guy, that's bad, or you captured the bad guy and took him to the police, that's honorable. And I'd hate to beat a dead horse here, but this could not be further from the thematic objective of the game's narrative. Dutch's gang always boasts about their moral place in the West. They steal from the rich and give to the poor. They're protecting freedom. They are equal opportunity. Are they moral? Well, you sure wouldn't think so from the perspective of Red Dead 1. If you only played the first half of Red Dead 2, you would think that Dutch and his team were the only good people in this godforsaken country. You see, Red Dead Redemption is a series so concerned with two entirely conflicting ideas. The first being that change is inevitable, and the second being that to America, there is no path for criminals to experience meaningful change. These two ideas are conflicting, but not in a way that is problematic. They're conflicting just like America is conflicting. Just like the government is advertising themselves as the paragons of morality in the West, all the while maintaining a world where Jim Crow laws exist. Just like Dutch insists that they are doing the right thing despite casualties from innocent people. The conflict and contrast of these two ideas are the driving force of these two games, and to say that John Marston is definitively dishonorable or honorable is not only inconsistent, but kind of stupid. I often talk about this term medium specificity in regards to video games and what they are able to accomplish that other mediums cannot, like movies or books. This is a great example of negative medium specificity, insofar that Red Dead Redemption is a game developed by hundreds of individuals, all with individual motivations and experiences and backgrounds. It is a massive collaborative effort that is taken on by many different departments and people that rarely interact in meaningful ways. Books specifically are considered the pinnacle of narrative expression in large part because of this individualized authorial intent. When I've talked so much about artistic focus in this video, this is what I'm referring to. And for the most part, Red Dead actually overcomes a lot of what many video games fall victim to. Still then, we have these horribly dissonant gameplay elements that are not only thematically inconsistent to the narrative, but instead thematically opposite. Completely antithetical elements of an artistic product can exist at the same time in video games, and it is considered an unfortunate quirk of gaming as a medium. The way the morality system interacts with the narrative's insistence on moral ambiguity is a textbook example of the gameplay designers not interacting enough with the narrative designers. Moving on. There's this idea out there that a man being out for revenge should dig 2 graves, yada yada. If anything, Red Dead Redemption teaches us that someone out for revenge should dig hundreds of graves. And if you compare John Marston to Niko Bellic, you start to see this formula that Rockstar clearly takes with their story design. This idea of the anti-hero's journey. Not the anti-hero's journey, but the anti-hero's journey. Okay, if we look at both of these games as flawed characters looking for newness and self-exploration, going on an odyssey, and coming out with valuable knowledge about themselves and the world, then you start to understand why it might be the anti-hero's journey. Niko and John unfortunately both come out of these games having lost something vitally important. Niko, either Roman or Kate, and John, his life, and with it, his son's innocence. In this way, John Marston doesn't really represent the Wild West. He isn't the embodiment of the nomadic mythology so many of us grew up on. John Marston is the last dying gasp of conventional freedom in the United States. His death signals to the country that there is no room for a changing of the bandit lifestyle, but only its entire removal. For better or for worse, modernity is coming, and there is zero room for compromise. It's actually through this interpretation that we start to look back on how we talked about John Marston as this frustrating, milquetoast, philosophically middle ground dude bro. He's neither cruelly pragmatic nor is he naively idealistic. Marston, much like the series as a whole, is being torn between multiple philosophies. Marston wants a life of safety and honest hard work, but he has to get there through savagery. Marston wants his own life, his own decisions, his own frontier, but he is forced to watch the government move in on his land as he is forced to work with the government. I cannot stress enough how this is not an indictment of Marston's character, but instead a necessary story piece to make Marston as enigmatic and philosophically inconsistent as the world in which he inhabits. He is a confused, battered, and broken man, a person with two diametrically opposed beliefs grabbing onto his arms, pulling him in both directions. I think this is why the Mexico section of the game is so frustrating to so many people, despite starting out so well with that excellent music score. John takes this sort of interesting departure from the rhythms and story beats of the whole first part of the game. Instead, you are being forced around not by the logic of the game's stories and John's situation, but instead by the game developers and the writing they have crafted. It's an important distinction, as the Mexico bits of the game can't help but make me feel like they were included strictly as a game lengthener, where we could have had an interesting exploration of the dichotomies of the two cultures and countries that would have been another staple in the thematic pages of contrast and conflict. Instead, we are met with these racist caricatures of lands riddled with unimportant and inconsequential people and missions. It's an unfortunate side effect of Rockstar's mission design, and it happens in almost every game in the GTA RDR verse. Because of the way they create missions, the rhythm of start point to travel with dialogue to incident to combat to escape to endpoint, Rockstar can just sort of add missions with seeming impunity to pad out the length of their games. The formula is just so applicable to just about anything you could think of. Of course, as we near the end of the game, the ending conversation with Dutch is in a lot of ways the ultimate ending to the game. And while the two games have a unique structure in terms of their lengthy epilogues, Dutch's descent is what really caps off the holistic ideological battle between John Marston and his past. It goes without saying that this moment in the game is made infinitely better having played through Red Dead 2, especially in the ways in which you see Dutch revert back to these cult leader type cliches. At one point, he even goes as far to say something like, "You'll never catch me alive," and later he does the whole villain, "You and me, we're no different, you know," type of shtick. What is important, however, is that he says that John can't change, that's the dagger, that's the important part here, that through all of the things the two of them went through, their nature is their nature. It's not their nurture. John's family won't change him. Killing Dutch won't change him. And get this, in 2010, Dutch actually refers to a mission that is played out in 2018's Red Dead Redemption 2, which is just awesome. He mentions, "We gotta quit meeting like this, John," which is referring to the events of the last mission of Red Dead 2, American Venom, in which Dutch and John have a standoff on top of a snowy mountain, just like they are now. He then hits you with his now infamous, legendary, soon-to-be-analyzed, "I had a plan, John." On a personal note, you gotta love these forward-thinking moments in games, even if they are a little manufactured and probably less of a thought-out plan than I might think. In Red Dead Redemption, Dutch is a myth. He's a man spoken about mainly in the third person. Most of what you know about him in the first game is via stories told to a person by a person who knew the person that knew Dutch Vanderlyn. Oftentimes these stories are of his heinous actions. Other times you hear about what a charismatic guy he is. Regardless, he is a man shrouded in a good deal of mystery as you play through the game, and crucially is once or twice removed from John Marston due to him having to deal with the lower-ranked characters like Bill or Javier Escuela. In this way, the story structure is in a lot of ways similar to that of GTA 4. Our hero spends most of his time systematically hunting down 2 or 3 guys that are somehow linked to a mysterious trauma from his past. The difference, of course, is the character's motivations. Nico is intrinsically motivated. He feels a compulsion to find and understand these men so that maybe he can come to terms with what he experienced. John, alternatively, is extrinsically motivated, insofar that his goal is strictly to find these men so that he can get back to his family and leave his life behind. But is John completely extrinsically motivated here, specifically with Dutch? In my opinion, there's absolutely no way you can say yes here without knowing what we know in Red Dead 2. The betrayal, the importance of their relationship, the manipulation. Dutch is a complete and utter hole in John's heart. A manipulative father who left for years for which the son has still only conflicting feelings about. It's not so hard to believe or sympathize with survivors of emotional abuse to be sympathetic to their abusers. It happens all the time. And this just isn't me making all of this up. Near the end of the game, John says to Agent Ross that he would kill Ross 100 times over before he killed Dutch. While that may say more about Ross than it does Dutch, it certainly implies that Dutch still resonates in John's soul to some degree. It encourages the player to think about John as a complex thinker, one that hasn't totally given up on Dutch's anarchistic Wild West sensibilities. Now, this isn't to say that John doesn't resent Dutch or even that he doesn't hate Dutch. He does, because he even sees Dutch murder an innocent woman by shooting her in the head. What John realizes is that Dutch is a man turned evil by ideological disillusionment, and because of that, he still sees the man that housed and raised John. These things are near impossible to let go of. Really, there are two analyses to be done here, an analysis of Dutch from the perspective of playing Red Dead 1, and an analysis of Dutch having played both games, looking at the character holistically. Now, Dutch holistically is the ultimate piece of evidence toward understanding the Red Dead games as thematics through contradiction. His entire world, his entire perspective and philosophies are paradoxical. Even he acknowledges this. Certainly John and Javier Escuela do. In one of their meetings, they spend a good deal of time talking about how Dutch's philosophies were just an excuse to justify their bandit behavior, and crucially that the whole gang knew this, but continued along regardless. Dutch's whole perspective is that no matter what, personal freedom and liberty should overrule everything else. That no matter what, one should fight for their right to exist in the way they choose to exist. From the origin of the second game to his dying descent here, Dutch believed that he was fighting the good fight, fighting against those that wish to control. And yet, just before he falls, Dutch mentions about how John can't fight gravity, that he can't fight against the coming wave of modernity. He then says, "But I can't give up neither. I can't fight my own nature." That's the paradox, John, you see? I mean, it's written right there. Rockstar was absolutely concerned with the ways in which Dutch represented the entire paradox and contradiction of the 20th century outlaw. His desire to preach the never-ending fight against the forces of control just does not interact with the sermons on the winds of change being inevitable. Remember when we were talking about the beginning of the game, about inevitability, about death? Remember when we spoke about how one person could live their life with any sort of comfort knowing that one day their lives as they know it will not exist? Dutch is certainly aware of this, and yet he still fights for this idea of anarchistic freedom. I think there's a lot of ways that one could interpret this inconsistent worldview, but really it all comes down to the characterization of Dutch as a sociopathic cult leader. We'll get into that later. Edgar Ross, on the other hand, the game's sort of second main villain, is supposed to represent that horseshoe theory of the Wild West in the sense that both sides of the conflict at their extremes are equally evil. The issue with Edgar in particular is that they make him out to be such an insufferable mustache-twirling villain that it doesn't even make sense in the thematic objective of the game. He's just like an unlikable person, not necessarily a compelling statement on the similarities between two sides of a conflict. The ending epilogue of the game, which has become somewhat of a series tradition now with the second game having an even more lengthy epilogue, is interesting and certainly unique. It reverts back to a lot of the monotony and normalcy of the first part of the game. There's cattle ranching, doing chores, and a whole lot less shooting. What this does different than the first part of the game, however, is that, at least for me, there was this feeling that maybe this was actually it for John Marston. You see, at the beginning of the game, when you're ranching for the McFarlanes, I knew that there was a story to be told. I knew that there were many who would die to my revolver. I knew that there was more shooting and looting to be done. After taking down Dutch and being returned to my family, this might actually be it for John. Of course, however, as we know, it wasn't. Just as Dutch warned John, Detective Edgar double-crosses John and invades Beecher's Hope with the U.S. Army. Uncle dies. Jack and Abigail run. John dies. Reminder that the years have softened the blow of this moment a little bit, but when I first played this, I was gutted. I was blown away and genuinely surprised at the way in which I was just brutally Swiss cheesed in my own backyard. On top of that, they give you the opportunity to think that you had the chance to win by using Deadeye. It's a great narrative moment and really hurt at the time. After this, the final member of Dutch's gang has died. The East, the U.S. government, the Yanks, the Pinko bastards, whatever you want to say, have finally taken over, at least in the metaphorical sense. It is likely Jack goes on to kill Edgar. Edgar probably has a son somewhere who goes on to kill Jack. Maybe Abigail kills that guy. Maybe that guy's wife kills Abigail. Okay, I'll stop. But it's vitally important that Rockstar says one thing with this ending here. Redemption breeds more redemption. Violence does not die with the West. I have so many questions about this game, about its development, about its role in video game history, about Rockstar, about it never being ported to the PC, about the sort of gymnastics the minds at Rockstar probably had to go through to even get this game anywhere near funded for development. I mean, if anything, this game just shows the pedigree and respect that Rockstar has been afforded as game developers. I believe it would be mighty hard to sell this concept to many publishers, let alone a game that is so insistent on dialogue and its aesthetic. Think about for a second the Wild West, the start of the 20th century even. The guns, they were samey, semi-automatic and inaccurate, a far cry from the automatic behemoths gamers have come to expect in their shooty games. You can't really design cities, at least not in the traditional Rockstar sense, and you have to deal with the overwhelming ubiquity of the uncolonized desert wasteland, and somehow make that a compelling play space for millions of players of all shapes and sizes. You have to deal with a game that is somehow supposed to narratively navigate the forced relocation and genocide of an entire race of native people, Reconstruction period politics that ostracized and lynched people of color legally across the communities and cultures represented in the game, and you have to deal with segregation, with women's suffrage, with indiscriminate sickness that killed 10% of children born. You have to deal with dysentery, with a land that wants freedom and oppression-free lifestyle, but only for those of the same skin color. You have to deal with a prevailing tidal wave of mental illness and madness, spreading rampant across an increasingly incestuous, racist, and illiterate people. You have to deal with modes of transportation that are inconsistent, unintuitive, and slow. How does a publisher sign off on making a game in this time? The answer here is twofold. The first being that Rockstar is a proven group of developers that have a track record of creating good, fun games about subjects that are, at their core, nefarious or uncomfortable. The second answer to that question is really that they don't make a game about those things at all. They make an interactive experience devoid of most of the realities of the turn-of-the-century West, and instead choose to ignore most of what defined that period of time for everyone living in it. As an interactive experience, Red Dead Redemption is the Hollywood reduction of the West. An intentional, thematically consistent choice by Rockstar, yes, but a potentially problematic one at that. Horses fly through the landscape with immaculate precision. John never becomes hungry or infected from his many bullet wounds. John will never have an overwhelming stomach flu that sidelines him for weeks, destroying his insides and later killing him unceremoniously under a rock in eastern New Mexico. John will never have to witness a lynching, take part in a race riot, or be forced to question whether or not women should be considered citizens. There is never a mission in which John Marston gets an acting job where he dons blackface in a movie because the director could or would not hire a black person. These are absolute, unavoidable realities of the time and place in which Red Dead Redemption takes place, and yet they're virtually absent from its production. Why? Well, the easy answer is because it's a video game, and because those things aren't very much fun, are they? The much tougher, scarier answer is that Rockstar might just be making a killing on creating caricatures of time periods that rely on racism, sexism, and washed away realities of the cultures and time periods that they have been tasked with creating. Maybe Rockstar is getting away with a sort of milquetoast centrism that defined the 2000s. Maybe Rockstar has more in common with the goalpost moving of South Park than it does the authenticity of a confident stance on something. Still, though, I remain that Red Dead is a valid and respectable attempt at artistic focus. However, that focus is on a Hollywood recreation of the old Wild West tropes and subversions of those tropes. It is not an authentic retelling of that time period, despite appearing to be so in so many other ways. It's not even a particularly careful piece of rhetoric, despite its insistence on authenticity in so many other places. It is not media that particularly cares for the collateral damage of its role in social politics, oppressed people, or those who are poorly represented. I think in 2010 this was easier to get away with. In 2019, I believe it is necessary that games start acknowledging those that were not acknowledged. I think there's a perfectly reasonable argument that games like Red Dead Redemption have at least some responsibilities to be edifying. If your game will recreate the weaponry of the time, the sounds and ammunition, the look and feel of its tools of destruction with such precision and careful consideration, then it should take the time to recreate the culture of the time, to inform its players of the realities of the world in which it existed. I played Red Dead Redemption 1 for the first time when I was 15, and I imagine many played it earlier and many played it later in their lives. I was lucky enough because I grew up in the state of Oklahoma, a state that only became a state recently because before that it was titled Indian Territory. In school, I was taught of the Trail of Tears. I was taught of the genocide of the indigenous people of this country. While I was getting my degree to become a teacher, I learned that depression and suicide is most common in children from indigenous families. I grew up near Tulsa, a city that was almost burned to the ground in a race riot that is practically ignored in schools in history today. So please read the Washington Post article linked below if you're interested. I imagine many of you have no idea about these Tulsa race riots. In my American literature class in college, my professor asked our class to raise our hands if we have ever heard about lynchings. 3 people raised their hands. He mentioned that the most recent lynchings happened in the 60s, the 1960s. These are not ancient histories of America we can choose to ignore. They are realities of a generation once or twice removed from you, the listeners. People are alive today whose parents were lynched. Do games have a responsibility to educate? No, I don't believe so. Should we criticize a game like Red Dead Redemption for being inconsistently authentic under the guise of satire of the tropes of Western media? I actually believe so. Again, the problem is the inconsistency of authenticity. Red Dead Redemption 2 is frankly a million times worse in this regard because they do double down on the realism of your weight, sickness, and life in the Wild West, but still continue to whitewash the political and social realities of the West. Red Dead Redemption wants to be a video game, an interactive recreation of the Wild West, yet it only wants to be so in what it chooses to make authentic. In this way, Red Dead Redemption fails as a piece of mature art that can be appreciated amongst cultures and time. It fails in the same way that many Rockstar games fail, in its misunderstanding of satire, not as a mode of subversive criticism, but as an excuse for lackadaisical cultural awareness. I understand this is a tough conversation with a lot of nuance and perspectives. I want to be clear that I respect and even admire Red Dead for a lot of its storytelling, especially when compared to its genre and medium counterparts. I am, however, confident that Rockstar's tenuous grasp on what satire actually is supposed to be is getting less and less convincing. I am, however, a white guy who is, to some degree, speaking on behalf of the people I am saying are unrepresented, and I understand the problems with that as well. I will link below a couple of articles from people of color who have raised issues with what I'm talking about. Oftentimes I lose people here in these videos. If you disagree with my interpretation of Rockstar's role in edifying their consumers, let me know in the comments. We have a lot more to cover.
Have already endured many disasters. Before, this was all our land.
And now we have brought you civilization. Well, sure, it hasn't been easy, but it hasn't been easy for anyone, Nastas. Why, I knew a man in Yale whose father once shot 18 natives in one afternoon out in Wyoming. Oh, the man was quite traumatized. He took to lying with choir boys.
For a wise man, you are a very stupid man, mister.
The mission design in this game is completely par the course for a Rockstar game. I kind of make these videos with the assumption that you have played these games or at the very least have an understanding of them. One of the big issues I have with this mission design that I don't think I covered in the GTA video is that it's frustratingly transparent in its pacing. This is to say, when you get to a new point in the game, you might be met with 3 different quest givers that you can choose from at any time. Go to any of these quest locations and you will begin a new story mission, right? You can do it in whatever order you want. The problem is, when that's the case, I know for a fact that the events of the quest will be pretty much inconsequential for the main story, and I also know that it will have little to no impact with the rest of the story or its characters. There is no bigger offender of this than the times when there is only one mission giver available to you, in which you know for a fact something big is about to go down. I hate this kind of pacing, and it kills a lot of the motivation and excitement you get going into each mission if you know it will almost certainly be a meaningless shootout with no real ramifications. This is especially compounded with Red Dead's insistence on an overwhelming ubiquity to its quest design, something that has been spoken about to death. The repetitive shootouts and horse chases do not raise questions, to me at least, about game quality, but instead about game length. The quests themselves are fine. Some are better than others, but most are perfectly exciting and operational video game story missions. The issue is how many there are, and how many one could take out. No place in the game is more guilty of this than the Mexico sections, in which John is taken to borderline asinine extremes in the name of getting closer to his old gang member Javier Escuela. John's insistence on being a double agent to both warring sides in the political battle for Mexico can only be explained away as a means to doubling the story missions available to the player. What could have been a further exploration of these themes of morality being a matter of perspective instead becomes a clear example of one of the many problems with video game storytelling and their publisher-demanded game length requirements. It is so frustrating to see characters I care about resort to stupidity or illogical decisions just to facilitate these missions, and it reveals a larger problem of the game, which is that John Marston is frustratingly impotent, and he really has little to no ability to change his circumstance or what is happening to him. In my Borderlands video, we talked a lot about what it means to be an instrument of other people's will. In Borderlands, it made thematic and gameplay sense in the story. In Red Dead Redemption, it comes off as inconsistent and strange given Marston's insistence on threatening everyone that talks down to him. It is so strange to me how much is told to us of Marston's ruthlessness, about how much we see it when we are given control of the man, but how little we actually see him do in the context of the game's cutscenes. Marston almost has this Joffrey syndrome of always threatening to punish those that stand against him, yet never actually doing anything about it. His impotence doesn't match what we're told about Marston, and that really is the problem. We are only told of the things Marston has done or is willing to do. Rarely do we see the signs of it. And I think this is a perfectly valid criticism of the writing in this game, of the synergy between story and its gameplay, of the character himself. In fact, I think a lot of criticism of this game is valid. I do not consider myself a terribly critical person. I am much more emotionally analytical of my media. What does it evoke? How does it make me feel? Etc. It's because of that I think I am more sympathetic toward Red Dead than a lot are, despite its heavy-handed writing and sophomoric character design. A lot of this game is emotionally effective through its dialogue, which is to say that the chasm between its gameplay and its writing is wide, even for video game standards. This is to be expected to a degree by a Rockstar game. What do you remember most from your time with Rockstar Games? The cover shooting or the conversations you had with the McCreary family on the way to the bank heist? Do you remember defending a wagon from a bunch of people running you down on horses? Or do you remember Dutch explaining to you why he is right and why you are wrong as he stares down gravity? In this way, both Red Dead games are better thought experiments than they are interactive experiences. The first game in particular, as we've learned, is heavily steeped in philosophy. The people in this game spend a good deal of time commenting on each other's intelligence, their vocabulary, or wax poetically about metaphors. A lot of the best conversations in this game are spent on horseback, riding next to each other, careening through such wide-open vistas for minutes on end. What better evidence do I have to the interactivity coming second to everything else than the game's implementing a ride horse for you button so that you don't even have to do the work of staying on the road. I do think that Red Dead Redemption is unique in this sense to some Rockstar games, and that is, of course, its use of space and sound. The rhythms, motions, sights, and sounds of the Wild West are vitally important to capturing thematically what the West represents. Oftentimes, people will immediately remember the ways the trip to Mexico affected them emotionally. The music, the lack of combat, it is all a great effort by Rockstar to create something emotionally impactful, all the while not stimulating the player hardly at all in terms of gameplay. It is something games are consistently criticized for, and should be rightfully celebrated when executed as well as they are here. Required viewing here goes to Super Bunny Hop's video on Quiet Time. The long odysseys through space do a little more than just allow for emotionally impactful quiet time, though. They act as ellipses, as signposting to the player that you are transitioning to a definitively new section of the narrative. Think about the trips to Mexico, and just how different the Mexico sections of the game are to the parts before it. Think about the trip near the end of the game, from the southwestern end of Mexico all the way to Blackwater, an almost game map spanning journey. These are moments that define the breaks in the game's thematics and narratives. They are beautiful in their executions, yes, but also beautiful in the ludic sense, in the sense that this is such an interesting, medium-specific element to video games. You know in books when you see those three little dots that signify a scene change? Those are ellipses, and these moments are ellipses to books as intermissions are to plays. Of course, you aren't actually traveling from Mexico to the Northeast, as the world in Red Dead is essentially a condensed recreation of all the major cultures and countries of the United States and Mexico. These long odysseys are one of the defining elements of the game, and it shows a commitment to the aesthetic story that Rockstar wants to tell. All of this we've spoken about really hammers home that question I had at the beginning of this section. How in the world did Rockstar decide that they could make money off of this game? Because despite every criticism I've had of the game to this point, every misunderstanding of satire, cultural insensitivity, gameplay hiccup, or unconvincing story beat, there really isn't anything quite like traversing the western landscape on the back of a horse while a guitar is gently plucked. In a pre-Breath of the Wild landscape, Red Dead Redemption was one of the only games to absolutely nail what it meant to occupy such an open world. Not an open world, but an open world. Sitting by a campfire 300 yards away from the nearest road and miles away from the nearest town is one of those aesthetic sensations that really only video games can provide in such power. That is how Rockstar intended to sell this game. As a recreation, a playground to explore and live out all of those Western movies that have defined a lot of media in the United States. To finally put your boots to the sands of the West and experience a time unexplored in video games. Somehow, despite everything else, Rockstar manages to continuously create worlds that convince you of their possibility, to appeal to all of those childhood dreams of fan-shooting six-shooters on a main street in town. In that sense, Rockstar once again solidifies themselves as perennial powerhouses in video game development. If you feel at this point that my thoughts on Red Dead Redemption are conflicting, inconsistent, or all over the place, you're not mistaken. The one thing I am consistent about loving, though, is the game's genuine attempts at creating something more than a strictly systems-based ludic experience, and instead their commitment to writing and designing stories, worlds, and people who you can tell are genuinely thought out, artistically focused elements of a holistic story. Oftentimes video games trend toward one or the other, right? Heavily missing the mark of this holy grail of ludo-narrative synchronicity. Sometimes the world design dwarfs the mechanics of a game. More often, I think, the systems and mechanics take precedence over the design of the narrative or aesthetic. In the first Red Dead game, I believe the former is true. Rockstar's second effort, however, nearly 8 years later, would have the opportunity to do both. To achieve the same sort of artistic focus found in the narrative of their first game, and manifest it inside of a game that's so compelling, equally artistically focused, with gameplay mechanics and systems. Did they achieve it? No. They do not. And I will not hesitate to argue that they managed to somehow create a game less mechanically focused and effective than a game from 2010. My time with Red Dead Redemption 2 is sort of troubling. It is so obviously an extraordinary feat of software. It is the game I think I would show my parents if I was trying to, sell them on video games as being artistic. It is oftentimes, for me at least, an unbelievable simulation. I cannot believe that Rockstar was able to realize the American West in such a breathtaking manner. It is the pastoral premiere, the Western wonder. Of course, like most things like this in video games, things start to fall apart a little once you start interacting with said landscape. I want to say a couple of things before we get too far into this analysis, just to temper the reaction and set fair expectations. The first is, Red Dead Redemption 2 is thematically similar to Red Dead Redemption, so much so that to cover a lot of the themes in the game on a base level would be to almost reread the last 12,000 words of this essay. What we will do is cover the differences, of course, and what 2 does uniquely. But let me be clear that A, if you skip to this part of the video to hear what I think about Red Dead 2, you're going to be confused because a lot of what I've talked about previously is important here. And B, my analysis of this game will be shorter. I consider the first part of this video as equally about Red Dead 2, and so should you. The second thing I want to get out of the way is that I am confident you've seen Naked Jakey's video over Red Dead 2's outdated game design. His analysis of the gameplay is about as comprehensive as I would ever hope to get, and I genuinely believe in and agree with most of what he has to say. In the event you haven't seen that video, go watch it, it's great. That being said, I will really only be covering the thoughts I had separate from that video. I want to start out, of course, with a little story. Isn't it funny how that leak came out before the game did that said there was a toggle where you could turn off your map and NPCs would give you meaningful directions, and that the world design was such that it made logical sense and one could navigate to quests as if they were really in the Wild West? Isn't it funny how no one really questioned that? At least I didn't. That seems like the natural and logical progression of Rockstar's open world design, especially after so many years of development. Isn't it funny how the game starts with this sort of implicit gameplay choice where you are given the direction to shoot someone in the snow, but you can also shoot the lantern for a little extra wrinkle in the set piece? I mean, I reckon a number of us did end up piecing this together and asking ourselves, hey, what if we shot the lantern instead? It's so heavy-handed as a choice, I have no problem reading it as a tutorial the developers put into the game to teach us that the directions don't always have to be the action. Isn't it funny how that sets a standard for the same sort of gameplay experimentation to be a core design goal in the game, yet rarely, if ever, appears again? To me, this encapsulates Red Dead Redemption 2 better than almost anything can. All bark, no bite. All tell, no show. All words, no action. RDR2 is a masterclass in having a visually outstanding world, yet an interactive dud of a game. And this isn't without trying. You can tell the developers set out to make their world and their supplemental activities meaningful and immersive. You have weight, food, hair growth, the camp system, honor and dishonor, NPC interactions, decisions. You have genuine attempts at creating systems that encourage the player to look at the game as a holistic, immersive experience, rather than a series of quests connected via a large loading screen we call an open world. The problem is, these genuine attempts, they genuinely stink. Rarely do they work at all as intended, and sometimes I wonder if they even work at all. Which is a darn shame, because this might be the most important sentence I could say in regards to my experience with RDR2. When I started doing story mission after story mission after story mission, with no breaks in between, my experience with the game improved dramatically. I could not put it away. I was up all night being told the story of Dutch's fall. I adored the acting, the cinematics, the twists and turns. It was the enjoyment I had hoped to get from the game and expected to get when I read the almost universal critical praise of the game. Why is that a darn shame, then? I can't help but feel it should be the opposite. The game had the direction and ability to be the game you don't want to progress through the story because of how great the supplemental open world activities are. Instead, I was met with a monotonous slog, a preventative menagerie of slow animations, meaningless activities and systems, and existential dread. It was a game designed to prevent you from playing the game. And I was one of the original players of the game that used to boast about, oh yeah, I'm still on Chapter 2, guys. As if it was some sort of badge of dedication toward the game for not progressing through the main story. What I wish I knew was how much I was stifling my enjoyment of the game, and how much better the strictly cinematic, authored elements of the game were. I feel like I should clarify this point a little bit because it really does come back to what I opened the video with. That existential dread, those moments of, why? And look, I understand that not everyone had this experience, but if there's one thing I hope that people take away from my videos, it's that video games are experiential. A lot of times, whether we like it or not, they are inextricably connected to our opinions and experiences outside of the game. When we are busy in life, sad, confused, or lonely, those thoughts color and emphasize our time with the games we play. This was certainly my experience with Red Dead 2, and I need to be honest with you about that. In the time shortly before and after the game's release, I graduated college, I moved states away to a place I've never been, experienced a crippling spell of job searching in a foreign place that led to a unique form of sadness mixed with homesickness. After getting a full-time job, I worked tirelessly, looking forward to coming home to a nice gaming session after spending time with the fiancé and cooking dinner. When I was normally met with was logging onto the game, 30 minutes of preparation, 30 minutes of hunting, doing chores around the camp, and riding my horse to the location. In a 2-hour play session, which was optimistic for my time, I would get 1, maybe 2 stories in. At some point, I realized that the stories, the carefully crafted moments Rockstar directed, were the most bang for my buck. And look, I realize that this is specific to me, and maybe not to you. And that's my whole point here. Experiences matter. Your current place in life matters. When I was 19, my sophomore year of college, I might have had the time to get the platinum trophy and fill out the compendium and immerse myself in the world of the game. Instead, I had to sort of craft my own experience, tailor-made to my circumstances. Even then, the game sometimes gets in the way and forces you to still sit through some overwhelming monotony. It's here that existential dread really comes in from both sides, surrounding you and your experience with the game. How do you motivate yourself to contribute to the gang's ledger, knowing that gameplay-wise, it doesn't actually matter how much you contribute? How do you motivate yourself to contribute to a gang that, story-wise, you know is going to be dead soon? You really do see it coming from a mile away, specifically with Arthur, who literally contracts tuberculosis, like midway through the game. The game isn't trying to sell the death of the gang and its members as a twist, but as dramatic irony that the developers are using. So how does the game motivate you? Through Arthur, the perfect character for this kind of existential conundrum. Arthur Morgan is one of my favorite video game protagonists in the last couple of years. He is so much more compelling to me than John, and I actually believe John to be more compelling than most. Arthur begins the game using the same sort of disguise as John, as a brutal, effective killing machine shrouded in some sort of gruffy moral ambiguity. The thing is, it does not take long for Arthur to separate himself as a genuinely moral and introspective man who actually communicates those moral stances through his actions and dialogue. He isn't the wishy-washy, tepid, enigmatic mystery like John was. He believes in the game, and at first he believes in Dutch. Think this is all, too deep, man? No, I think even the developers themselves cheekily acknowledge this in the game itself. At one point, someone says to John, "See, your attempt to look all enigmatic and mysterious, it may work for Dutch, but you just look stupid." It's why seeing Arthur's beliefs be shaken is so powerful and effective, because he actually has them. He has beliefs, he has morals and thoughts and purpose. This, of course, brings across the problem mentioned before and mentioned in probably every video game analysis video from now until the end of video game analysis videos. The game intends on making your choices matter, you the player, through honor systems and notoriety and relationships in your camp. These are all supposed to matter. Yet Arthur has clear morals about right and wrong, and murder and innocence, and who deserves to die and who does not. Nico's behavior in GTA 4 could be excused as a result of this because the game didn't insist on gamifying and quantifying your open world antics at every turn. I cannot say the same about RDR 2. But the comparisons of the two protagonists can really end here because of one very important distinction to make about this game. Arthur is the playable character, but the story here is about John Marston and Dutch Vanderlyn. Arthur is really just the lens in which we see it play out. The main characters are John and Dutch. The goal of this story is to contextualize a lot of the characterization mysteries from the first game. And let me be clear, it does this well. The main story here is incredible at doing what it sets out to do. The thing that it succeeds at most, above John, above Arthur, above even the world design, is contextualize and make sense of Dutch Vanderlyn. This is Dutch's game. He is the main character. He is the character the game intends on studying, on understanding, on fleshing out, and even making sense of. The same could be said for Marston, and that is true. However, Dutch receives the most care in terms of, how did this man turn into the man we briefly knew in Red Dead Redemption 1? It is of my opinion that the chapters that separate the game are designed to mark moments in Dutch's degradation as a man and as a leader. He starts the game off as a meaningful, genuinely effective leader of men and women, a man as dedicated to the cause of his gang as the members themselves. He leads by example, he provides, he puts in the effort. Sure, he was idealistic, but he gave the diverse members of his group something to believe in, even if they kind of knew that the realities of the world opposed Dutch's philosophy. I think for the disenfranchised, the poor, the orphaned members of Dutch's gang, hope is what they need, and hope is what Dutch is willing to afford them. The issue is, of course, for Dutch, hope was a meaningful altruistic goal. It was a genuine attempt at bringing peace to a group of people that he believed in. Unfortunately, as the chapters and time roll on throughout the game, hope goes from the unifying belief that allows for the survival of the gang, and unfortunately turns into the very tool that Dutch uses to exploit, betray, and destroy the very people he swore to protect as leader. And it's that change, that degradation of the use of hope, that really characterizes Dutch throughout the entire game. He is the classic egotistical cult leader, the quintessential abuser of power. The game opens with Dutch going out on his own to retrieve members of the gang on his own. He is charismatic, empowering, and genuinely effective with his dual revolvers. He is neither all bark nor all bite. He's both bark and bite, an almost unrealistic paragon of effective gunslinging and leading. Dutch's people believe in him. They fight for him, and they aren't afraid to die for him. And crucially, Dutch seems to not be afraid to die for them either. He genuinely puts himself out there at the tip of the spear, willing to go into the front lines on the basis of someone else would do it for me.
But we lost some folks. Now, if I could throw myself in the ground in their stead, I'd do it gladly. But we're gonna ride out, and we're gonna find some food. Everybody, we're safe now.
If you've played the game through, you know how important it is that the game starts with Dutch doing all of these things, because so much of the main plot points revolve around Dutch not doing those things when they are needed. Chapter 2 is often referred to being something like the happy chapter, or the chapter that no one wants to progress out of because those were the good times. And yes, compared to the times ahead, Chapter 2 feels like a sunny vacation. However, a lot of the initial cracks of Dutch's failure begin to show here, at least in the sense that some of his more harmful habits begin to arrive. He begins professing what will soon become somewhat of a haunting motif in Dutch's arsenal. Gentlemen, it is time to prosper. The bad times are behind us. This sort of manipulation leaves his members feeling empowered now, but will end up leaving them convinced of Dutch's madness, convinced that Dutch has always been somewhat full of crap, convinced that the last couple of years in Dutch's gang have been the story of a man using 20 or so people to his own ends. But Arthur hasn't quite realized this yet. Chapter 3 could easily be seen as the chapter in which the game turns from, okay, to, oh god, this is gonna suck, isn't it? Dutch's mission turns from the betterment of the gang to the betterment of himself in this chapter, and it all happens through his desire for revenge. He is so hell-bent on getting his revenge and evening the score with the O'Driscolls that it ends up actually directly endangering the members of the gang, something that doesn't seem to bother Dutch at all. This was always his main objective, the safety of the gang. Now, Jack is kidnapped and the gang is caught up in a meaningless civil war with plenty of bloodshed to go around. Crucially, I think Arthur gets captured here and extremely badly injured. Arthur is able to navigate himself out of the situation, but where was that unbreaking motivation Dutch had in the first of the game where we leave no man left behind? Where was his aggressive plan to get Arthur out? This is the first in a series of many instances like this, of Dutch just not putting in the work necessary to be the gang's leader. What is Dutch's goal here? It can only be summed up as self-serving, as selfish. There are a couple parts in Chapter 3 that I think is something that the game was missing dearly. Occasionally, during the long horse rides and moments in the game, you get to see Dutch and Arthur genuinely meld, laugh, remember, and look to the future as friends and colleagues, not as a clear leader to second-hand man relationship. Sure, we begin to see cracks develop. We are seeing the seeds of doubt be planted into Arthur's mind in this chapter, but I love seeing them just work. They are clearly prodigal outlaws, incredibly effective in their heisting abilities, but also as people who genuinely care for each other for a long time. I really wish we got to see more of that in the game. In Chapter 4, the man begins to really go downhill. No, actually, the man begins going so fast downhill that he begins burrowing through the ground so quickly he plows through the Earth's core. Dutch goes from making uncharacteristic decisions to making the decisions of a complete madman, a man so divorced from the collective, united reality he once lived that his entire objective for the gang has changed. Now I know I am speeding through the chapters here, but again, these videos, while long, are not really supposed to be full story analyses, but instead looks at the characters that define the story being told. Chapter 4 has Dutch beginning his usual routine of just one more job, a technique used consistently across time by cult leaders, corrupt politicians, and oppressive kings. This time, he wishes to endanger the entire crew on a heist of which is based on faulty information that ends up being incorrect. It's rash, it's poorly thought out, and it ends up essentially being the inciting incident that gets the whole gang practically killed. To me, Dutch shows 3 core character developments here in Chapter 4 that are the key to understanding his degradation as a character. The first is maybe the most important. It's Tahiti. The entire goal of the gang was to go west. Now it is to go to Tahiti and start a life for themselves all of a sudden. This is actually a super common manipulation tactic used by cult leaders and politicians alike. Whether it's paradise or heaven or let's just get back to the way things used to be. Manipulative, egotistical leaders will often use an unspecific, unattainable location or goal as a means for manipulation and control. Dutch uses Tahiti here because he knows no one in the gang knows a lick about Tahiti. He can say what he wants, sell it as a beautiful place where no trouble will follow, and his gang will believe him. At least that's what he thinks. Tahiti is to Dutch as heaven was to David Koresh. It is an instrument of control, a means of manipulation. This is actually made doubly bad because Dutch often mentions the money hidden in Blackwater, yet all but ignores it and tells his gang to forget it in this chapter.
Let's all leave together. We need enough for a boat. Now, I found a friendly ship captain. He's willing to take us to Australia or Tahiti. We just need to pay for passage and give him money for land when we get there. No questions asked. We will disappear, be reborn.
Well, where the hell is Tahiti?
South Pacific, an untouched paradise.
Who lives there?
Tahitians, I guess.
What it lacks in subtlety, it makes up for in effectiveness. Dutch has completely moved the goalposts here. He is a changed man. The second core development here is Dutch's relationship to Micah, a new member of the gang. Micah has been a member for, under a year, yet is given the same reign as a decades-year-old member like Arthur or Jose. Why? Because Micah is a yes man, that's why. A suck-up, a teacher's pet, an anything for you, Mr. Vanderlyn kind of guy. As cult leaders devolve, oftentimes they surround themselves with people like Micah, because the alternative would be to surround yourself with reasonable people like Arthur or John, who speak with skepticism and concern for Dutch. Having Micah around is a constant validation of Dutch's goals. What this does, however, is further exacerbate the disconnect that Arthur and John were already feeling. Obviously, this becomes much, much worse in later chapters. The third and final moment of Dutch's complete degradation comes in the form of punishment. For Dutch, the gang used to take precedence over any selfish need. The second that Dutch drowns Angelo Bronte in the lake and leaves his body to be ravaged by piranhas and gators is the second that Dutch officially goes over the line of ruthless but effective leader to selfish cultist. It's funny because, and bear with me here, this scene is so thematically and narratively similar to that scene in Borderlands the pre-sequel where Jack airlocks all of the potential betrayers of his cause. It's so brutal and so unnecessary, yet to Jack, and Dutch in this case, it seems like the best course of action. Of course, all of the onlookers only see madness, and we have seen what that ends up meaning for both Jack and Dutch. In the previous games, okay, wow, both games contextualize their villains much better by showing their descent into madness. That's kind of a really interesting parallel I hadn't considered yet. Okay, watch my video on Borderlands if you're interested.
Part of your philosophy books cover feeding a fella to a goddamn alligator, Dutch.
The part that covers weakness. That part.
I don't know.
Well, I do. It ain't nice. I know it. But it is us or him. I figure it might as well be him.
Speaking of madness, something I certainly speak a lot about in the Borderlands video, Chapter 4 ends with an interesting development in Dutch's path that I just can't really take a firm stance on either way. Essentially, he bonks his head, like really hard. And I think that the game is trying to tell us here that he is giving himself some sort of concussion that is supposed to influence his thinking as the game goes on. And sure, this could be a reason for his descent into madness, but what does that moment serve the story of the game? If anything, it seems as if this moment undermines a lot of the careful craftsmanship that went into creating Dutch's downfall. Am I expected to believe that this concussion is the reason Dutch insists on robbing the Lemoyne National Bank and getting Jose killed? Am I expected to believe a concussion is why he chooses to forget the money in Blackwater? Or is this some sort of masterful storytelling red herring that I'm falling victim to here? I hate being so lukewarm on story elements like this and not having something meaningful to say, but I just can't rationalize a good reason to imply the concussion's role in Dutch's madness, especially since it was clearly already happening before the concussion. Okay, the Guarma section of the game kinda sucks. It was clearly rushed, it's shootout after shootout, and has some unfortunately insensitive characterizations of indigenous life on these islands. Even things on the software side don't really work as well. With glitchy animations and texture pop-ins, this is almost like a condensed version of the Mexico section of RDR1, a clear length pattern that just doesn't end up adding much to the experience as it does take away the momentum. Chapter 6, however, is where we get peak Dutch. The Dutch we will all remember. The best acting, the most memorable lines, that Dutch. The have some goddamn faith, Arthur Dutch. Really, the final death rattles of Dutch's gang are simple and certainly foreshadowed. Dutch commits to this unreasonable butt-kissing of Micah, he refuses to share his plans and instead resorts to asking his members to have some faith, and maybe his worst crime, is he dissuades going after John after losing him in a firefight. This is the moment Arthur knows that he has lost Dutch, and he begins to find out how to stop him. The have some faith thing that you hear Dutch say so often really is the culmination of this idea of him being a cult leader. I think for a lot of manipulative people, there's always this line of last defense. If you spent years gaslighting people into believing that you are in control, when you become out of control, all you can really say is just believe me. It doesn't work for Dutch, and I think it rarely works for anyone else in this position of crumbling power. Midway through Chapter 6, Dutch has officially gone from doing anything to keep the gang safe to literally taking on the United States Army, with a bunch of indigenous people and gunning down one of the most rich men in the world in broad daylight. Any semblance of Dutch trying to protect his party is gone. The final moment of this happening is when Dutch leaves Arthur to die once getting the necessary amount of money from Cornwall's distillery. Arthur sees it happen in real time, and it confirms every suspicion he had of Dutch. In the final showdown between Arthur, John, and Micah, Dutch walks away, officially showcasing the end of the Vanderlyn gang. Dutch embodies this unique anti-Machiavellian philosophy that it's really hard to pin down. As a ruler, a gang leader, a boss, whatever you would call him, he tends to believe in leading by example and through strong moral stances, especially at the beginning. A Machiavel would lead through fear, not love. A Machiavel would have a stringent disregard for morals. Dutch, on the other hand, does the opposite up until around chapters 4. I think it's that change that really acts as a helpful heuristic to understanding Dutch's degradation as a leader from altruism to Machiavellianism. This is all assuming, of course, that Dutch wasn't being duplicitous from the start. I tend to truly believe that Dutch really did experience degradation, a fall, rather than him being a duplicitous egoist the entire time. That question, though, really is the core of the philosophical base of the entire game, and I think that question can be effectively boiled down into inevitability. It should color your entire interpretation of this game, of this series, really. What is and isn't inevitable? Obviously, we have seen that explored through the inevitability of our protagonist's death, but what about change? Is Dutch's downfall inevitable? Should we interpret his character as someone who is always destined to become the man he becomes, as if he was born with some gene and it's intrinsically inside of him? I think that's why the concussion is so frustrating and confusing to me. What is that saying about the themes of inevitability in this game? The epilogue of this game, for as long as it is, really takes this thematic reading and plays around with it. I like the epilogue for this reason. I think that the developers understood the epilogue as a time to sort of take their time with some of the deeper, more philosophical elements of the game, and give the characters time to breathe. Some of the best moments of the entire game take place in this 3 or so hours of John Marston playtime. John and Abigail's date, the house building montage, the drunken nights with Uncle. It's also endearing and really acts as this somewhat haunting moment of realization for most every player if they've been paying attention. Red Dead Redemption 2 wants to deliver a twinge of heartache with every moment of happiness. They want the game to be a constant reminder of the cost of redemption. For every happy moment with Uncle, we are quickly shown him being slowly roasted alive by a bunch of insane hill people. For every cute moment with Abigail, we are reminded that John is not long for this world, and that Jack is destined for a life of violence and pain in an attempt to redeem his father. This cycle, this inevitability of pain and heartache, is what is really at the core of RDR's thematic objective. It's why playing the game was so hard, why I experienced such existential dread and confusion. It's why an investment in the world and the characters actually can prohibit the enjoyment, because knowing that these men and women are inevitably doomed is unfortunately quite the horse pill to swallow. I always appreciated Arthur's cold-bloodedness in this game. He has this sort of Michael Jordan-esque focus to his killing, to his thievery. He is what John wishes he was in the first game. Arthur is a ruthless Terminator, a man so effective with the tools of his trade that it really drove home that previous complaint I had about John being all tell and no show. Arthur is almost the opposite, and while I love him as a character, he is genuinely frightening as an adversary. Of course, this contrasts in this really beautiful way with his introspection in the face of his impending death. It's sort of unexpected, actually, how poetic he is. He probably always thought he was going to die in this line of work, but he definitely didn't think it would happen like this. With all this time to think about it, I think most gunslingers assume their death will come without them really knowing. A bullet to the head doesn't give you a whole lot of time to think about your place in the world. Tuberculosis, though, days and months pass where every cough reminds you of your mortality, your lasting impact on the world. All things considered, Arthur handles it perfectly. He handles it like Chapter 1 Dutch would. How do I best leave my friends and family? It really contrasts well with this John Marston's insistence on murder and threats, but that being essentially the only defining characteristic of his character. When you pair it up with Nico, John, and Arthur, you actually get this pretty cool, unique mosaic of interesting takes on the murderous rogue. One could probably create some sort of D&D-esque character alignment chart of all the Rockstar main characters. I'm thinking that crazy dude from GTA 5 would be like chaotic neutral. Okay, I don't know what I'm talking about. I cannot stress enough how fun and interesting this story can be, and would implore you to watch the cutscenes or a Let's Play. It's just such a shame so much of it has to be buried beneath so much anachronistic gameplay and slow pacing. The missions are the worst, as shown by Nakey Jakey in his video. Their design is no different than the design of a mission from 2010. There has been zero evolution on the side of Rockstar toward making these missions more fun, interactive play spaces. And it really is a shame, and is again a reason why these games are outstanding character studies and narratives, but such uninspired video games. There is so much more to this story. So much more. It is genuinely great and deserves recognition despite being far too long. It is so insane to me that the main character's slow death to disease and its implications seems to pale in comparison to the emotions, the storytelling and acting, and the philosophical implications of all of the different relationships. It really goes to show how effective Rockstar was at making this John and Dutch's story. If I were a stronger man, with infinite amounts of time, no full-time job, and a 5-hour YouTube video, I could dive into each of these characters and their roles in the wider understanding of the gang itself. I love how the game deals with so many people, giving them so many unique and diverse personalities and traits, yet democratizing them in a way that makes sense and feels unified. I love how each of them can represent a different way or objective of the gang, how the moneylender informs the gang's stance on wealth disparity and control, how Abigail, being an ex-prostitute, represents this idea that people in the gang can come for new beginnings, how Sadie represents the gang's rejection of gender roles. Early in the video, I mentioned how if you just took the start of the game, you would think that Dutch's gang was the very best group of people in the entire West, and how that plays into this idea of there being evil and oppression on both sides. This is certainly the case for the first 3 chapters of the game. It's just such a shame that the rest of the game continues the unfortunate Rockstar trend of treading on such tired and insensitive stereotypes about indigenous Americans and other people. This comes down to the fact that there are 2 native characters that you end up meeting are 2 sides of the same stereotypical coin, the bloodthirsty warmonger and the pacifistic soothsayer. When your only representation in your game is 2 worn-out stereotypes, it shows a lack of understanding and effort placed into understanding the cultures in your game. And Charles is the obvious caveat to this, except that despite being born to a black and indigenous mother and father, he is acted by neither a black nor an indigenous American. If you think this is a social justice warrior rant, seriously consider your ability to sympathize and understand perspectives and logic different from your own. I find this casting hilarious and sad because we recently criticized how the games refuse to tread upon themes and realities of the West like blackface in Hollywood. Yet here we are, in the actual development of the game, we have someone performing as a different race of their own. It's a horrifying irony that really invalidates a lot of the progressive elements of the Vanderlyn gang. Note that I am not claiming that Charles' voice actor is a white man donning red face to play an indigenous American. I am not blaming Noshir Dalal, a Parsi and Japanese actor, for playing this role. I am, however, blaming Rockstar for casting a man who was, and I quote from them, pretty damn ethnically ambiguous, enough to play a character who is neither of the races represented in Charles. I blame Rockstar because pretty damn ethnically ambiguous is just doublespeak for the racist homogenization of all races besides white. And by them refusing to find an alternative actor for Charles, they are implicitly combining hundreds of unique races and deplatforming those that can actually represent the characters in the game. If you don't think that is a modern digital form of redface, I would ask you to open your mind. In a conversation almost completely defined by the labor rights and quality of environment Rockstar's employees worked on, we also can't refuse to have a conversation about the deplatforming of Black and Native actors. And that conversation about the labor rights should happen and should continue to happen. I often ask myself during my playthroughs of these games whether or not it was all worth it. I tend to think that it was not. My life would be marginally different if I had never played this game. But even with that being said, the conversation is complicated. I know all of this is, and I would hope that people actually involved in the creation of this game could make sense of it. I will link any articles or testimony I find on any of these subjects down below. I want to temper my analysis of this game with a bit of analysis of interactive elements. I cannot stress enough, again, just like the first game, how at odds the gameplay is with the thematic objectives of the game. They are preventative, annoying, binary, and inconsequential. There aren't enough adjectives, frankly, to declare the ineptitude of this game as an interactive experience. There are the things we have mentioned before, the camp system essentially accomplishing nothing, the morality system being diametrically opposed to the morals of the game, and of course the lack of player participation in practically any of the missions. I don't have a ton to say more about this that hasn't already been said. However, I don't think people are talking enough about the money system. I cannot stress enough how important the currency of a game is to its immersive ability and balance. Red Dead 2 severely misses the mark here, and I think it does have consequences past the strictly gameplay balance section. It reveals a deeper problem, one that I will harp on until the day that I quit writing stupidly long video game analysis videos. By the end of my playthrough, I had more than enough money to sail to Tahiti, scout it out, buy a plot of land, and return. Then buy everyone else's way over to Tahiti, destroy that plot of land I bought earlier, buy another, and then have enough left over for the welcoming party whiskey. I could list off every inconsistency, every boring minigame, every insignificant beard grown and bath never taken. The funniest, maybe most glaring piece of evidence toward this is the man in St. Denis preaching the practice of eugenics in the town square. Punching this guy, roping him, or just shooting him will all end in you losing honor points. These gameplay and story departments are so obviously disconnected, so obviously dissonant of each other, that it might just prevent Red Dead 2 from being the masterpiece game of the generation that it really could have been. Overall, I think Red Dead Redemption 2 is better than the first game, but only in the sense that the story being told carries it far past the story told in the first game. The complexities of character and the plate juggling of conflicting moral philosophies really drive home the series' affinity for contrast and conflict. At times I am reminded just how far video games have come from the SNES and PlayStation games I used to play as a child. And this is certainly one of those games. It's a visual spectacle, a stunning display of adept artistry. It is unfortunate that those feelings are immediately followed up by this thought. For every tremendous leap video games have made in terms of art and visual fidelity, interactivity has followed it with a crawl. Okay, I want to thank you so much for watching this video, and I also want to ask you to stick around for a little bit longer so we can chat. It's been a while since I've uploaded, clearly. I don't think I should apologize for that, but I do want to say I expect that to change slightly. I recently moved states away, graduated college, bounced around jobs, got engaged, planned a wedding, and now I work 3 jobs on top of this one, if you want to call it that. I am trying to make myself a life in this world, and it's sometimes easier said than done. But you don't really care about that, do you? You want that sweet, sweet, pretentious video game analysis, don't you? Well, let me say I'm planning on doing that as well. I don't know what's next for me, but I have had to come to some sort of realization with this channel that I'm gonna have to work at my own pace. Unless my videos blow up for some strange reason, I'm gonna be doing this as a simple hobby. I have no delusions about becoming internet famous. I just want to create content that I would want to watch. I've also come to terms with the fact I will probably end up making more videos about franchises than single games. I enjoy this perspective because I love writing about and thinking about the ways in which those franchises evolve and change over time. I don't know what's next in terms of games to cover. Maybe I'll write a shorter video about something non-gaming related, just to fill the space. I have 1,500 subscribers at the time of this video. That is more than I could ever have imagined, so genuinely, thank you. If you are really into my content, the best way to support me right now is probably to do the normal like and comments and sharing and all that, but also coming to my Twitch stream. I think that's the best way to support me. Come by, say hello, stick around, and follow. Talk to me about games and philosophy of games and all that nonsense. I love it. I have this problem where I upload one of these videos and then in months after, I am always wishing I talked about something more in the video. At some point, I have to cut them off though and just make the darn thing. I talk a lot about what I wish I could have added onto these videos in my stream, and I also talk to you guys about my videos. Okay, I also did an interview with the wonderful Zach Frazier, which is like 3 hours long or something, and it's a good look into my life and thoughts and just sort of opinions on games. One last thing. I like these end of the video sections because I always get to talk to you guys as friends catching up, but I figured in the future I can structure them a bit more. So if you want to, in the comments, ask me a question by writing above your question, a question for David. And write that before your question, I'll answer it in the next analysis video's end. Follow me on Twitter and Twitch, it's all in the description. Thank you again for watching. I really hope you enjoyed.